All right, everyone, good afternoon. Today we have a lively conversation queued up with two dear friends of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Ron Bailey and Marian Tupy. They've recently produced a remarkable book, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know, and many others you will find interesting. Ron is a mainstay at Reason Magazine, where he routinely brings clarity to science and unpacks the implications of what we know for policymakers as well as the rest of us. He was the inaugural Warren Brooks Fellow here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute way back in 1993. His co-author is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and an animating force behind the essential website, humanprogress.org. I encourage you all to sign up for their weekly email missives. Of course, I'm talking about Marian Tupy. And together they have produced a timely look at the state of the world. It's a handsome book, has spare prose, clear charts, and arresting photography. And critically, everything in the book is extensively cited. And if I'm not mistaken, the references that I thumbed through are easily accessible sources that would pass muster in any news or classroom anywhere in the world. Before we start the conversation, I have just a couple administrative notes. We are recording the event today and we'll make it available on YouTube. If you're watching live, I'd like you to be part of the conversation. So throughout the next hour, I'll monitor questions from the audience that come in online. You can either email them at events@cei.org, or if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should find the Q&A button that allows you to send them in to me directly. And then finally, I want you to buy the book. This is what it looks like when you find it on Amazon or at a bookseller. Take it in. The next hour of our conversation should serve as an appetizer, because if you miss out on the connections between these trends and the data presented, you are really missing something essential about the world we live in today. So Ron, Marian, thank you for joining us today. Whenever we have co-authors, I'm a little unsure of where to start, so I'm going to throw out a question and just see who answers first. I'd like to know, how did this project come together? It's clearly an extension of the work you've each been doing, but if you don't mind my saying, I think this collaboration offers something new and quite valuable that neither of you were doing before. So where did the partnership come from, and what's the motivation for the book?
I think I should start with that, Marian. Don't you agree?
Absolutely.
I've had I've written several different books. I've been following the environmental issues and policy issues and scientific issues for quite some time. And and the books have been fairly successful, but I had been in the back of my mind, I was trying to figure out how to get information in easily digestible portions to people. And so I came up with this idea basically of a picture book, a data picture book. And that was noodling around the back of my head for a couple of years. And I was going, how do I pull this off? Where would I go for this kind of thing? So I had the brilliant idea of going, well, there's this site, Human Progress, and my buddy Marian Tupy's been doing this. Why don't I take him to lunch and make this proposal? So we went to lunch and we talked about it, and he said immediately, yes, let's do it. And that was about 2 years ago. And so we've been working together on this, up until the book was published in August, essentially. So the idea was mine, but the execution depended crucially on Marian helping me to figure out how to do it.
And all I can say is that the book has done more, better than we expected, I think, in a sense that we are heading into the third printing. So you are kind enough to tell the audience that if they like the book, they can buy it. We sold out the first two printings, and the third printing on its way. It should be out in middle of December. So if you have a difficulty buying it, please persevere. We are going to have many more copies available.
Pre-order now, because it makes a wonderful Christmas gift, a New Year's gift, birthdays, weddings, whatever. You can't have too many copies.
And I actually think, lastly on this subject, that maybe even we have underestimated the market for optimism. I mean, we started with a certain number of copies, and we were worrying, are we going to sell out? And now we are on the third printing, which means that there really is a market for optimism, provided that the evidence is provided to the reader in a digestible and visually arresting way.
Well, let's pick up on that, Marian, because even before we get into the trends, these major world events that are shaping how we live, where we live, the way we interact with one another, one might be forgiven for asserting that either or both of you wear rose-colored glasses. I mean, the book is chock full of good news.
Right.
And I wonder if you had, most writing projects have a problem of cutting down and editing down. What did you leave on the cutting room floor? What didn't make it if we have an entire book full of good news?
I think that we could probably have spent much more time talking about good news in America. We only have 10 trends which are focused on the United States, but most of the trends are global.
Right.
And we feel that we are pretty exhaustive when it comes to the global trends. Very often you are held back by the availability of evidence. You can have a nice chart for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years,
Right.
because many more institutions, many more think tanks have started to track different types of news, different types of human well-being. But when it comes to the core of human well-being, we really have data going back only to the 1960s or so, or so. And so those are very well covered. But as I said, in the last 20 years, there has been a massive flourishing of new indices and things like that. Cato's Human Freedom Index is just one of them, which we haven't included because it is much shorter in time. And there's always a trade-off. Do you want to include more data but for shorter periods of time, or do you want to stick with fewer data but over long periods of time?
Right.
And because we believe that the fundamental point that we are trying to make is that today is much better than what life was before, and we aim at the longest possible data sets, we have ended up with 78. Could we have few more? Yes. Could we have few less? We could. Yeah.
And I would also like to push back against the notion that these are optimistic trends. They turn out to be optimistic. They're not rose-colored. These are based on completely uncontroversial data that anyone can get hold of. And the idea was to show how much human life and the prospects of human flourishing have improved over the last 2 centuries or so, or further back when possible. And these are just facts. They're not colored, if you will, with any sense of rose-colored glasses or a tinge of optimism. These are just facts. And part of what I was trying to do and what we're trying to do with the book is to let people know how can you fix whatever problems that still remain in the world unless you know where we are now and you understand the factual basis of what created, if you will, human flourishing of the sort that we have in the 21st century and how that might continue. So I don't want to say this is optimism. I want to say it's realism.
A lot of people who work on this subject are no longer referring to themselves as optimists. If they ever had, they refer themselves as people who just pursue the subject of factfulness, because it's Hans Rosling's word, the notion that if you present facts to the people, they will realize that the world is in a much better place than most people assume. In fact, that the real state of the world is a much better state of the world than people think.
So,
now,
I like to use the term reasoned optimism, which is to say, with evidence and logic and putting arguments together, we have reasons to be optimistic that positive trends can continue, that negative things in the world can be contained and shut down. Is that fitting, or do you think I have the wrong language there?
No, I mean, the way I like to think about it is I present realistic news about the world, which then fills me with rational optimism about the future of our species. That's how I would put it.
Right. And the other reason that we picked 10 global trends was for smart people, is that the problem is that smart people are attending to news, they read policy papers, they read books about the problems of the world. And I felt like that they get overwhelmed with the bad news, that they are always, they already know what the problems are. But what they really need is also a background of how far we've come and how many problems have been solved to then help them figure out where we go in the future.
Something we've discussed in previous book forums here at CEI, Ron, I think you're hinting at, you're coming right up to the edge of, and I hope the two of you can discuss. You cite Jonathan Haidt's work, but we've also had Matt Ridley on talking about innovation and its role. We've had discussions about the power of bad with John Tierney and his book in the last year. And it's this idea of loss aversion, that people really get hung up on negative outcomes, much more so than the equivalent or balancing positive. How does that fit with, kind of the news of, if it bleeds, it leads. If it's tragic, it makes the front page. Is that something that you tackled proactively, or did you just follow the data?
Well, actually, we explain that in the first chapter of the book, the introduction to the book, where basically we're saying there are psychological glitches that humans have, which make them attend to negative data far more attentively than they would to anything that's positive out there. And loss aversion obviously is one of the big glitches that we have in our psyche through evolution over time. Again, one of the things is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but we are the descendants of the people who, during a period of evolution, when someone heard a rustle in the bushes and said, that's just the wind, it turned out to be a lion, they were selected out. But the person who said, it could be a lion, and ran away. So we are the descendants of the scared people. And that worked fairly well for us. But the problem is that it misleads us when it comes to actually looking at the longer term trends that we try to document in the book. Also, another problem is that progress hides itself over time, is that we forget how bad things were 70, 100 years ago. I mean, average life expectancy in the United States was 47 years in 1900, 47 years, and only 31 years for the entire planet. It's now 72 years for the entire planet and about 80 for the United States. But people forget, when you're looking back, how many children died, for example, and how much infectious disease was laying waste to the population. Most people died of infectious diseases in the early part of the 20th century. And those kinds of things have been forgotten. Progress hides itself. And so we are trying to remind people that there has been there's been a lot of progress. And because of the past progress, we can look forward, we hope, to further progress in this century and future centuries.
So there's a related effect that gets some brief mention that I think is worth drawing out here, especially for our audience. And that's what's called the Tocqueville effect. Could you discuss that briefly? The idea that people notice those things which are more rare?
Yes, so Ron already mentioned that progress masks itself, and it masks itself because we tend to redefine problems as we tackle the previous problems. Right. So, for example, prior to the 20th century, it was perfectly normal for children, even very small children, to work, including working in very difficult and very dangerous jobs. Then, during the course of the 19th century, for the first time, in very few selected places in Northwestern Europe and North America, a substantial number of children could be pulled out of the workforce and put into schools because their parents started to make enough money to be able to buy everything they needed, including schooling for their children. And so suddenly it became possible to see a world where children didn't have to work. And so child labor became something that became increasingly unacceptable once it was obvious that children didn't have to work. But for that to happen, you first have to have rapid economic growth and increases in income. And we could talk about these sorts of things across the political spectrum. We could talk about racism and racial discrimination, what it meant to our ancestors when slavery was perfectly acceptable. Well, we got rid of slavery. Then lynching became then people continued to lynch each other. We took that out of the equation. Then we had discrimination and basically apartheid in the South. We took that out of the equation, and now we have ended up with talking about police brutality. Once that's taken out, what will remain? Microaggressions. And people will obsess about those, but it's a different it's a different animal from what people had to deal with before. So as things become rarer, we redefine what it means that we are looking for. And the psychological experiment in this particular case that was conducted by two Harvard psychologists was that they showed people threatening faces on the screen. And as they gradually withdrew more and more of those threatening faces from the computer screen, people started to redefine non-threatening faces as threatening, just to keep looking for what they were supposed to be looking for.
So before we get into the trends, I just want to extend this conversation about the Tocqueville effect and loss aversion. One more overarching element that I think I saw in the construction of the book, the spine, if you will. And I want to make sure that you have a chance to spell it out for people and help people understand it. And again, Ron, it's referenced in the beginning in that introduction. You talk a little bit about the framework provided by Acemoglu and Robinson, the difference between societies or nations that rely on extractive institutions, both political and economic, versus inclusive, primarily politically and economic inclusive institutions. And that framework of understanding how societies move through time and change, I think that's really important for us to get a grasp of before we dive into natural resources or agriculture or the way people work, the different trends that you outlined. Could you talk about that for us?
Well, when we were looking at the longest term trends, for example, in global income trend, if you will, average per capita income and life expectancy and so forth, what happens is they don't start turning up until around the beginning of the 19th century, around 1820 or thereabouts. And why would that be? Throughout most of human history, the natural state of humanity was poor, ignorant, short-lived, violent lives over time at the edge of starvation. That was for the majority of our ancestors lived that way, unfortunately. But something happened around the beginning of the 19th century where new institutions came into existence, and those institutions began to allow for human flourishing of the sort that we document in the book. And those institutions, the way that Acemoglu and Robinson talk about them, they call them inclusive institutions. And I always try to use the framework from Kindly Inquisitors. There are the three institutions: our democracy, how we decide who gets legitimate power and allows for the peaceful transfer of power between leadership; capitalism, or if you will, free markets, which enable people to innovate and progress over time and build up wealth over time. And then I think, as a journalist, I would think this, of course, the third institution is what is called liberal science, which is basically freedom of speech, radical freedom of speech. Everybody gets to criticize everybody else. And it's an Enlightenment notion is of, well, I may not know what the transcendent truth behind the universe and the meaning of life is, but I'm pretty damn well sure that you don't either. So why don't we agree to leave each other alone? And that sense of tolerance and permitting criticism, those three institutions coming together, democracy, capitalism, and, if you will, radical free speech, enable the period that we've all enjoyed in the 21st century and the creation of the inclusive institutions that allowed for what we call, as our first trend, the great enrichment.
And those were incredibly important. And to them, I would simply add that they're related, really, that science has enabled more people to survive, and population growth has been a tremendous driver of human progress. This is something that is underappreciated. The fact is that ideas are produced by people, and the more people you have communicating each other in freedom, the greater the likelihood that they are going to come up with an idea which is actually going to push humanity forward.
I'm going to, if I may, slightly disagree. Without those institutions, more population leads to the Malthusian world that existed prior to, if you will, 1800. But
Like
you
in
don't
France.
have to always agree.
Yes.
So I'm starting to get some questions in from our audience. Before I pitch them to you and tackle those, could we just maybe highlight or take a quick tour of the top 10 trends that are in the title? You've mentioned the great enrichment. We've had some discussion about natural resources, which is one of the top trends. But we're also talking about poverty, famine, urbanization. What else is a major trend that we really want to get our arms around to be one of those smart people?
Well, the great enrichment is basically the fact that if you will, global GDP has increased almost 100-fold over the last 100 years, or the last 200 years or so. And the flip side of that, though, is the end of poverty, because you could imagine that some people say, well, all right, fine, the world got a lot richer, but the top 1% got most of the gains. Well, we're pointing out with the end of poverty, which is our second trend, well, that's not true. And around 1820 or thereabouts, 90% of humanity lived on less than $2 a day, probably a lot less, in fact. And by 1981, that had gone all the way down to 40-some%. So basically, it took 160 years for us to cut absolute poverty, living on less than $2 a day, in half. Since then, it's dropped to less than 10%. It's been the fastest drop in poverty in all of human history. And that's one of the trends we wanted to highlight in that regard. And and there are a whole bunch of others that come along with that. But my particular one that I think that people probably don't know and don't think about as much is there's more land for nature now. One of the things that we point to is some fabulous data out of the University of Maryland, where they have used satellites to look for, if you will, forest cover and other kinds of plant cover over the globe since 1982. And what you find is that on every continent except for South America, forest covers have been increasing over that time, which means, again, the other thing that's happening is that people are withdrawing from nature. We're getting more food from less land all the time, which means there's more space for other species on the planet to flourish over time. So I'm actually thinking that the 21st century will be a century of very strong environmental renewal and not an age of extinction, which you hear a lot about anyway. After that, I'll let Marian carry on.
Well, let me just interject for a moment, because this is one of those, I think, hallmarks of the book, which is it's data intensive, but it's accessible. So the story that is told, both in charts and the prose, about the greening of the globe, and the greening of North America, I think, is specifically referenced. As I recall, you include a data set that is not quite as positive as the University of Maryland data set, which is just a couple years old. And that allows the reader to keep exploring, to do their own research, to do their own homework. And I think that's a real mark of intellectual honesty and character here, is that that's going to put the book in good stead for scholars in the future, other researchers. But Marian, I might have cut you off there, because I did want to get about the integrity of these citations, because that, I think, really is characteristic of what you've done here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we thought it was very important to only use data from the most credible sources. And with regard to the trends that appear in top 10 that I personally like, in addition to what Ron said, I really like the stats on hunger and malnutrition and access to food. If you're going to live a long time, you might as well be better fed than rather than be starving. And I'm a kid of the 80s, or rather, I sort of became conscious in the 80s. And I remember those terrible predictions of hunger and famines in places like the Horn of Africa and so on. And if you take the 2,000 calorie diet per person per day as the base, the reality is that today, in the poorest continent in the world, which is sub-Saharan Africa, there are only 2 countries which have a calorie supply of less than 2,000 calories per day. In the 1960s, in the early 1960s, it was like 35 or 40 countries. And so today in sub-Saharan Africa, on average, people have access to about 2,400, 2,500 calories per person per day, which is roughly where the Portuguese were in the early 1960s. In America and other developed countries, we have access to close to 3,000 calories per person per day, for better and for ill. But the bottom line is that in most of the world, people are no longer starving, unless, of course, they are being brought to starvation by very bad politics or war. Or economic mismanagement, like in Zimbabwe. And although this particular statistic is not used in the book, it may be of interest to your audience, and which is that over 90% of American workers who earn minimum wage earn about between $9 and $12 per hour. That's on the minimum wage. Of course, there are some states where it's lower, but 90% of workers earn minimum wage between $9 and $12 per hour. And Costco chicken costs $4.99. That's an entire chicken which contains 1,100 calories. So basically, for an hour of labor, you can get today enough calories to sustain you for an entire day. Our ancestors had to work from sunrise to sunset to live on the edge of starvation, and basically everything they did during the day was just to produce those 2,000 or 3,000 calories to survive. Today, even a very unfortunate person who lives on minimum wage can get the food aspect of his or her budget taken care of in an hour.
I want to rewind our conversation for just a moment. I forget already, but one of you mentioned inequality. And we have a question here from Bill. And he says, in a primitive world of widespread misery, there's little inequality. As things get better, they often do so non-uniformly, creating inequality. What happens to progress if the dominant culture demands absolute equality? That is, no one can improve their condition unless everyone's condition improves. Who wants to tackle that, Marian?
I guess I would start on this because I've recently written something on that for National Review. The first thing to remember is that inequality is absolutely essential to progress. If everybody, it's a handmaiden of progress. If everybody lives in a cave, but Ron Bailey lives in a palatial dwelling on a hill somewhere, that inequality is providing us with evidence that better life is possible, that we can aspire to, and the whole society can then follow the person or the group or the nation that has moved ahead of the rest. So if inequality was not permitted, if we insisted on inequality, on equality of outcome, we would probably still be living in caves. Inequality is vital, which is part of the reason why even somebody who is really a very careful scholar and a very thoughtful scholar, slightly to the left of the political spectrum, Steven Pinker from Harvard, says that inequality is not a proper measure of human well-being, provided, of course, that inequality is arrived at in a legal way that is compatible with liberal values. We are not talking about inequality in Iraq, where the ruling elite can appropriate for itself a lot of wealth. And to answer, to follow up on that, yes, if the society demands equality, it will tend towards stagnation, and I would say even worse, because egalitarian society, because people have a natural inclination to improve their own lot and of their own families, and the only way that you can prevent them from doing that is through totalitarian measures and often mass murder, which is why that is what we saw in the Soviet Union when the kulaks were destroyed. But it is also what we have seen in Nazi Germany. Very few people understand that the main or one of the main criticisms that the Nazis had was that certain groups of people were overrepresented in certain areas, such as banking, for example, or media, or arts, and so on. And in order to get proportional representation for everybody, they felt they needed to impose all sorts of discriminatory laws and ultimately put people in concentration camps. So this notion of proportionality and equality of outcome is actually very dangerous, and it has been tried extensively in the 20th century to the detriment of humanity.
And yet, Marian, you should talk about this, is it that countries are becoming more equal over time, that in fact there's a great convergence.
That is right. So there is a difference that people have to understand between national equality and international equality, which is to say that if you live in a place like communist China under Mao, or a place like North Korea or Czechoslovakia, where I come from, income differences between people are quite low, but people are poor. When you introduce the free market, when you eliminate central planning, what happens is that the enterprising individuals are going to become much richer, and inequality within the country increases. However, as a result of all of that wealth creation, the whole country becomes richer, and therefore international inequality declines. So there is actually an inverse relationship between domestic equality and international inequality. More domestically unequal societies tend to catch up more quickly with rich societies.
Okay, I'm going to jump toward the end of your book for this next question. It comes from Ed. He asks, how do you see the penetration of new technologies, communication, info, biotech, AI, accelerating the pace of progress?
I'm extremely excited by that. In fact, I think that the stagnation thesis that certain people have been propounding is completely wrong, that we are going to go through a period of very rapid and accelerated economic growth over the next couple of decades, if we can maintain the inclusive institutions that permit that kind of innovation to go forward. I do have some concerns that politics can get in the way of that. But I do think that the combination of those technologies is just going to be amazing. The perfect example is something that we do mention in the book with regard to vaccines. All of those technologies came together to basically create the vaccine that was just announced yesterday for the COVID-19 virus. It went from 10 months when the virus was first identified to a vaccine that will be fairly widely available a year later. That has never been done before and would have been absolutely impossible to do even 25 years ago, probably even 15 years ago. Already the combination of AI and biotechnology and the communication collaboration that can be done across the globe. After all, Pfizer was working with a German company to come up with this vaccine, has enabled that kind of progress. And that's just the tip of the medical iceberg that we're going to be seeing emerge over the coming decade.
Now, I'm cheating because I'm actually looking at the book, but you include some data here on the speed of vaccine development that is really just remarkable. Polio, smallpox, these are more than 3,000 years from the identification of the problem, the disease, to vaccination. Cholera, typhoid, 2,300 years. We don't even get into the hundreds of years until we're talking about rubella and diphtheria, which 250, 350 years. Ebola, 20th century problem, 43 years from identification until vaccine. And now we're in human trials in 4 to 6 months from the identification of January 2020 of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 coronavirus. It's really astounding because the scale of your chart doesn't even do justice. Like, how do you measure 1 year versus 3,300 years? Typically, your charts, I found the x-axis, it goes back as far as you have data, and it does a pretty good job of giving you a sense of change over time. But this one, I don't have any recommendation for you. I would just say that it doesn't do justice to the information you're presenting. Okay, I want to ask also about a whole category of data that we don't work on a lot here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, but I think it's really important. And I spent a lot of time with this chapter or segment of the book, and that's the what I'll call the peace and warfare issues. Could you talk about that and what you found, the changes about human welfare as a result of a decline in warfare?
Well, that particular chapter was obviously inspired by Better Angels of Our Nature, a book by Steven Pinker from about 10 years ago, who really has done the heavy lifting on identifying the trends. And he actually shared with us a couple of those data sets. So thanks to him. But he was heavily criticized for publishing that book by a number of people who felt that how could you possibly say that violence is decreasing? And in reality, subsequent studies have proven him right. Other independent scholars who have looked into this concluded that yes, we are living through a much more peaceful and less violent world. Not only have international conflicts pretty much disappeared. Yes, there was a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which just came to an end, hopefully, but even that wasn't a proper declared war. But international conflicts have pretty much ceased. We have a lot of civil wars for a variety of reasons, religion, primarily, things like that. But again, much lower than what they were in the 1980s. Crime is back up, experiencing a bit of an uptick in the last year in the United States, but it's nowhere where it was in the 1960s and 1970s and the 80s in the United States. Even people.
Let me ask about this, Marian, because I was trying to reconcile as I worked through these violence trends and warfare and peace, military spending as part of the discussion. The global war on terror, to use a phrase that I don't think anybody really thinks fits, but it's useful in that we have a common understanding. This has been a 20-year saga, at least for America. Is what you're telling me that while it's important, and maybe due to things like the Tocqueville effect, we place more importance on it, it's not of the same magnitude of the type of problems that we experienced in the 20th century? We need to keep it in perspective. Do I need to tell my friends at Cato that it's not as big a deal as they think it is?
I think that's what I believe. Well, everything depends on what you measure. At the height of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s, the United States spending on the military was between 6 and 8% of the GDP. I believe that at the height of the war on terror, it was about 4% of GDP, 3.5%, 4%. It's hovering around that even now. So when it comes to military spending, yes, the figure itself is massive, but as a percentage of GDP, it is lower than what it was before. That's one thing. The war on terror has obviously killed many fewer Americans than the impression that people have. In the United States, many more people die by slipping on a wet bathroom floor than due to terrorism. But because terrorism is such a dramatic act, people are able to think about it and pull it out of their memory file at a much faster pace than say, for example, the threat of killing yourself in the bathroom because you have never seen somebody dying that way. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but those are my initial comments on that.
But the bottom line is to think about it this way: you're much less likely to be killed by your fellow human being at any time else in all of human history, as violent as some places still are. The fact of the matter is that the levels, for example, we do global homicide rates, and back in Florence during the Renaissance, your chances of dying there as a male being murdered by somebody was like, I forget, something like 300 and 100,000. It's down to
5 for 100,000. 75.
Yeah, and it's down to 1 now in Italy. So I mean, and these trends are going. There are a few places where medieval levels of violence unfortunately still exist, and we document those. But the homicide rate has been declining globally over the last 40 years or so as well.
Well, I think this not just the violence and warfare and peace discussion, but all of these trends, um, they left me asking the question, well, what comes next? What's the second act? How will you update this book in 20 years? Are we seeing declining marginal returns on these trends? Are you going to have 10 entirely different trends 20 years from now? What are the areas we need to be focusing on to most improve human welfare?
I think that we will probably pay much more attention to the environment. One thing that you know of is that as countries become richer, as people become richer, they start caring about things like the environment, the welfare of animals, and so forth. That's not a bad thing, by the way. I think that in many places around the world, paying attention to the welfare of animals is premature. Because there are a lot of people and a lot of babies who are still dying, and there are these trade-offs that people have to make. But as society grows richer, those trade-offs change, those calculations change, and people have much more time and money to devote to clean air, clean water, improving life expectancy even further. I suspect that as we become richer, and Ron thinks that we will have $100 quadrillion economy, or was it quadrillion dollar?
No, there's just a quadrillion, just one little quadrillion.
What's an order of magnitude among friends, guys?
When we have a quadrillion dollar economy in 2100, I think that people will be spending a lot of their money on extending their lifetimes and remaining healthy. We see that throughout rich societies. That's what people spend more time on. Of course, we will also have more leisure time. The leisure time.
One thing I didn't see, and maybe suggests, every good research project ends with some version of the line that says more research required. I would love to see the type of analysis that you've done where you could dive into trends in humanitarian activity, philanthropy, meaning well for our fellow man and helping others along, either through market interactions, which are often easier to measure, or through genuine philanthropy, which don't have prices and contracts necessarily associated with them. But that seems to me part of the ongoing trend. As society becomes wealthier, more secure, happier, these sorts of things that you're documenting with housing, food, violence, security and their property rights, these other political institutions, looking out for each other seems to be a measure that we haven't really got our arms around.
And we haven't really included in the book, if memory serves. But I would offer a reason, and Ron and I haven't actually discussed this, so this could lead to some very interesting conversations. But look, everything depends on what sort of caring about your fellow human being you have in mind. For example, I have absolutely no problem with remittances across borders. Having a lot of people from Mexico and other Latin American countries making oodles of money in the United States and sending it home to improve the lives of their children and their wives who are left behind and so forth. No problem with that. I also don't have a problem with caring for the indigent, both domestically and also humanitarian activities across the world after a tsunami, after an earthquake, and so on. But one has to distinguish between different ways of caring for one another. For example, foreign aid. We could put in a statistic showing that foreign aid has blossomed to a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. But does foreign aid do actually any good to people who receive it, or rather, can it do more harm than good? Can the welfare spending in the United States reach a level where, again, in that quadrillion-dollar economy, can it reach a level where a significant portion of the American public will basically say, you know what, I'm cool with what I'm getting from the state. I don't need to do anything else. There are.
It's interesting. I made a note to myself when I was reading. I have a habit. I don't know if it's good or bad. I vacillate on that point, but I mark up my books. So I wrote all over your book. But I made a note that for every Steven Pinker, there's a dozen former or aspiring World Bank Ivy Leaguers. And I think that speaks to your point. You know, government-driven humanitarian aid doesn't have the best track record, and oftentimes creates moral hazard. It creates all sorts of negative incentives so that we don't see the results that we want, which is the flourishing of human welfare and human activity. So I subscribe to and encourage you to keep developing those thoughts as we look at other trends and the future trends. Ron, I tried to.
One of the other things about the future trends, if I may add on to it, with looking to sort of how things are likely to turn out. Yes, the global economy is likely to be over a quadrillion by the end of this century. And that's just on regular trends. I mean, there's no huge acceleration required or anything like that. I actually think it'll probably be higher than that. But another consequence of what's going to happen, and part of what Marian's talking about, is that people are withdrawing from nature already. And world population is probably going to peak at slightly below 9 billion or so, somewhere toward the, I don't know, 2/3 of this century. And if current trends continue, with regard to life expectancy and so forth, which I'm not sure that they will, but again, on that extrapolation, the world population will be down at the end of the century to about where we are now. That's because the number of women, the number of children the average woman had over the course of her life in 1960 was 5. It's down to about 2.4, 2.3 now. And the Lancet just came out with an extrapolation basically saying it's going to be 1.5 by the middle of the century. So world population is going to top out. The other trend is that 85% or 90% of people at that time will be living in cities. That means, if you think about it, most of the people will no longer be living on the landscape, and the farm productivity will be vastly greater than it used to be. And what will happen is that only about 1.2 billion people will still be living, if you will, in the countryside in some way, again, withdrawing from nature. So I really do think that we're going to see a huge greening of the planet, and again, a flourishing of nature in a way that that will basically reverse a lot of the destruction that had to take place as we developed over the last 2 centuries or so. So I think that's I think that the environmental trends are extremely positive.
On this point, I have a pair of questions for you. The confluence of population and urbanization, how that affects agriculture and the development of food security. The first is from Ben. He asks about something that he may or may not realize is not in your book, but what about the trend in government spending and the trend in regulation? Where does that fit with this model of extractive versus inclusive institutions?
Well, I'm going to just talk about government spending very quickly. And that's really what I was driving at in my previous answer, is that there is what's called a Wagner effect, whereas governments, or rather as societies become richer, governments tend to spend more and more percentage of their GDP on social welfare, primarily on social welfare. I mean, you look at Britain or the United States in 1900. Government spending as a share of the national product was somewhere between 2 and 5%. Okay, and then it's taken off. I mean, it cannot go on indefinitely, because at some point you get to Sweden in 1991, where basically the economy stalls under the weight of taxation and everything collapses. So it's not something that can go on indefinitely. But there is that relationship, and what worries me, just to reemphasize, that at some point our understanding of poverty or need for redistribution or hatred of inequality will become such that a substantial portion of the population will really have everything taken care of, won't have to work. And that is not a very happy state of affairs either, because people derive a lot of satisfaction and meaning in life from working and from accomplishing something more than just sitting on a couch and watching TV. So yeah.
Well, let me pick up on that. And again, related to these trends that Ron, you're talking about for the century, for population, where people will live.
I should first point out that this is a bunch of smart people who are doing exactly what I say they always do. They're finding problems. They're not thinking about where progress has been yet. But anyway.
What in the context of, there's a discussion, there's a whole group of trends that you document with broadly political institutions. So we're talking about suffrage, we're talking about speech rights, we're talking about recognition of unorthodox life choices. That has spread, that has improved in the last century by quite a bit. What does it mean for institutions and those inclusive institutions for things like property rights if 80 and 90% of the world's population is moving to an urban center? Their property will be financialized. It will not be in place, in soil and home. What can we expect about the development of these core attributes of a free society?
It's an interesting perspective, I have to say. When I lived in Latin America for a while, and Central America during the Contra period and so forth, and of course, people are always talking about land reform and land rights and so forth. And the thing about those societies is they're desperately poor, and the only thing of value there was, in fact, land, because they didn't have much of an education. The property rights were terrible and so forth. And so people were seeking that. The future world I'm thinking of is not the kind of property you could own would be intellectual property, if you will, the stuff that you've learned in your education. Of course, you would own your own home and that kind of thing, if that's the way the world is going to go. Protecting property rights is absolutely critical to maintaining prosperity, but this notion of home and soil and so forth, I think that will become a lot less critical. I think that
does that necessarily mean that we will have a 21st century reevaluation of intellectual property?
I think that we're probably going to have better technical ways of protecting intellectual property and less reliance, if you will, on legal institutions for doing that. But that's a discussion for another time, I suspect. But it's not only intellectual property, but also the property, the kind of wealth that people are able to accumulate through their innovations, through their work and so forth, will also need to be protected. Again, owning land is something that is, how shall we say that? It's so 18th century.
Okay. I want to see if I can squeeze in concluding remarks. And so I'm going to ask the two of you to, this is multiple choice. You can take your pick. You can do some or all of the above. Cover any topic that we didn't address that you hoped we would have covered. Ask your counterpart, your other author, a question that I should have asked, and or tell us about a project that you're working on now that you're extremely excited about. I'd love to hear about any or all of those things. Marian, maybe we'll start with you and then turn to Ron.
Thank you. A couple of things that I want to raise with regard to trends that we haven't covered really. One is that freedom of the press is freer than what it was in the 1970s and 1980s, but it's not as free as it was in the first decade of the 21st century, which is to say that freedom of speech, freedom of press needs to be something that we have to keep an eye on and try to protect. When it comes to representative government, the statistic which we have in our book deals with quality of democracy. It deals with the extent of democracy as measured by the degree of democracy in independent countries. But when you look at the trends, it's obvious that democracy or democratization of the world has plateaued. And on some measures, it is slightly declining. Democracy is not by any means in full retreat, but it is again something that we need to keep an eye on. It's in rude health, but no longer expanding at the kind of pace that we were used to in the 1990s. In terms of the project that I'm working on, I'm finishing a book with Gail Pooley, from an economist from University of Hawaii, from the Brigham Young University in Hawaii. And that basically updates the Simon Ehrlich discussion for the first decades of the 21st century. The book is going to be called The Age of Superabundance: How Population Growth and Freedom to Innovate Leads to Human Flourishing on an Infinitely Bountiful Planet. And what the project is really all about is trying to actually calculate in a mathematical way the real impact of population growth on greater abundance of resources. We know that resources are cheaper than they used to be. We can tell that by prices. But what is the marginal added, what is the marginal value of every additional human being comes to the planet, who is born on the planet, in terms of making resources more plentiful for the rest of us? This hasn't been done before. That's what I'm working on, and I hope to have the book finished by the end of the year.
Well, I look forward to that. I think I might have had an opportunity to hear you present some results of preliminary work a couple of years ago. So this is a passion project that's been in development for some time. We'll look forward to that coming out. Ron, let me turn to you and ask, do you want to put Marian on the spot about anything, or tell us about work that you're doing that you're particularly excited on?
This is not on the optimistic side. Something I'm looking into is a development. I suspect that many of the folks may have heard of the precautionary principle, which I summarize as basically never do anything for the first time. There's something worse out there, and it's called responsible research and innovation. And basically, it's a group of folks who are trying to heighten, if you will, the precautionary principle, and basically say social considerations must come first to any innovation, and we will not allow innovation unless it is socially okay. And I want to research that and reveal this conversation going among some academicians right now as a pernicious and dangerous trend that needs to be stopped as quickly as possible. So that's what I'll be working on for the next couple of months or so.
Wonderful.
And given what both of us said about some of the negative trends that are going in the world, I just want to end by emphasizing that there is no law, no force that stipulates that everything that we have seen improving up to this point has to improve in the future. Our understanding of human progress is basically retroactive. We are asking a question: is today better than what it was yesterday? And on many, many, many indicators of human well-being, that is true. But that doesn't mean that humanity cannot screw things up very, very badly moving forward. If you buy into our theories as to what is responsible for the world of abundance that we live in, which is to say inclusive or free economic and political institutions. If you buy into that, then we have to go on defending it, because without that, it's perfectly possible that humanity will take a wrong turn and destroy the progress that we have achieved.
Before I say thank you to each of you, I'm going to literally steal a page from your book and give a special shout out to someone who I know is watching the program today. I'm one of those guys who reads acknowledgments and reads the citations, which is why I was so heavy on your footnotes early in the program here. But as part of the acknowledgments, if you'll just humor me, I want to share, you write, although they have not always agreed, Fred Smith at the Competitive Enterprise Institute has greatly helped Ron to sharpen the latter's thinking on public policy, especially with respect to the problems stemming from government failure. What a wonderful tribute. I was just delighted to find that as I got toward the end of the book here. I want to thank you both for being with us, but more so for the production that you have put out into the world. This is like I said, a lovely book, something that I think it can hit many audiences. It is the first book among the entire series that we've done in 2020 that I will be taking home with a mandate for my children to pay attention to. I take every book home. I leave them laying around to see which ones the kids will pick up and read. And I've had a couple takers. This is the first one that's going to have a carrot attached to it, so there'll be a reward for them to spend time with this book. Thank you both very much for that. I do want to encourage our audience to spend just 90 seconds. We have a 4 or 5 question survey that will automatically populate on your screen as we close the program. We do read those. We read every single one of them. They help us shape these programs and improve them in the future. So as you go out into the rest of the day, I want to remind you to participate in Marian's Market for Optimism and encourage you to join us in a week. In fact, it will be 8 days. Our next program will be next Wednesday, November 18th at noon. We'll be right back here with National Review's roving correspondent, author Kevin Williamson. We'll look at his new book scheduled for release just the day prior on the 17th, Big White Ghetto, Dead Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, and High on Rage and the Dank Woolly Wilds of Real America. I spent a couple hours with that book over the weekend, and I know it's going to be a great conversation. In fact, any conversation with Kevin is one that you don't want to miss. So until I see all of you again, Ron, Marian, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. And that's it for the Competitive Enterprise Institute today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.